I have the daunting challenge to be speaking to a room of Chinese experts, and my only knowledge of Chinese politics is what I've read from your own work in the past week. So it's a bit scary, but I've been asked to talk a bit about the nonprofit sector, the nonprofit field, and kind of give you some of my reflections on what are the key themes, what we can learn from Canadian politics, because my area of expertise is Canadian politics, Quebec politics as well, their nonprofit sector there, and then give you some conclusions or future directions or suggestions of where you can take your work. So I really humbly offer you some of my thoughts and reflections. One of the things that I approach this commentary as someone who's been working on the nonprofit sector in Canada for 20 years. I was part of the initial discussions when we were thinking in Canada about the growing importance of the voluntary sector. There was the rise of nonprofit sector field in the US, and we were trying to come to terms a bit like you've been coming to terms with what is the sector, how do we define it, how do we generate awareness around its importance in the policy field. And I remember in '94 reading 150 pages on the concept of the third sector and what it meant and what were the implications of social economy. So I've been there, and I want to use that a bit as some of my commentary for what I take away from your research. But I didn't realize that there was a whole history of civil society sector. So I just assumed that this was a new field in reaction to the tremendous growth of the nonprofit sector in China. So apologies if I get that wrong. I come at this as well as someone who is francophone. I come from Quebec, and one of my areas of specialization is the nonprofit sector in Quebec. And it's, for those of you that don't know Canadian politics, Quebec is a French province. It has a very different European tradition than the rest of Canada. The nonprofit sector, the voluntary sector, is quite different in the way that it engages with the federal government, with the provincial government, in part because of cultural issues. Ideas, language, concepts that are used in North America don't really apply to Quebec politics. For example, volunteering. Does it translate in French? You didn't say that there was sorry, in Quebec, there's not a huge tradition of philanthropic giving or charitable giving. Actually, the levels of donations are significantly lower than in any other province. And part of that is because of the cultural context, because of the institutional context and that kind of history. So when I look at Chinese politics and I hear you talking about language and definitions and all of that, I'm very sympathetic to that as well. So, as this conference attests, China's dramatic transformation has itself inspired a broad body of research from a variety of disciplines. We've heard political economy. I saw a lot of sociology here today, not a lot of management or public administration, but a lot of diversity in the approaches to the field. And what I was surprised is that people are increasingly embedded in the field of NGO studies, more than before, and the findings that I found from the research, I was quite impressed by the solidity of the findings that were in your papers. One of the key themes for me at the conference has been the rapid growth of the nonprofit sector, despite the content, what I seem to see as a flux and uncertainty in the legal and regulatory framework. So it's quite surprising that you can see this kind of growth and development despite these kinds of challenges. And to me, China's rapid NGO growth demonstrates that the path of sector development are broader and more varied than are generally predicted in nonprofit research, especially the North American models, right? We know it tends to be market failure, voluntary sector failure, government failure as an explanation, or their social origins, our paths are set through some kind of class negotiation, and then we just kind of follow through on that path. But what I heard today was a lot of variety, much more attention to not just the institutional past, but current choices and agency as well. And I thought part of that was because of the recent growth. I mean, when you're in the middle of change, it's messy. There's a lot of things that are going on, so it's hard to take a step back and start to look at trends. But in Canada and in the US, we've been looking over a 100-year period, and I think because of that, we have this modeling which is often simplified. So I think it's refreshing to have a bit of that messiness and see the interplay of institutions and actors and start to grapple with change and policy change. I think arguments relying on institutional explanations are useful, but they are less helpful for helping us understand policy change. Institutions, they shape and constrain our context, but actors make political decisions, and that's how I define agency. And I sign a lot of your papers, although agency was implicit, and I invite you to be more explicit with the agency. I saw organizations strategizing, navigating their environment, even their relationship with the broader public to generate awareness. So there's a lot of agency within that kind of institutional constraint. So the ways in which political actors interpret problems and identify solutions are important. Canada's experience offers, for me, an irrefutable lesson to nonprofit studies. NGO development is far more complicated a phenomenon than simply attributing it to government failure or market failure, or as like the traditional government nonprofit theory would say. Much of the literature that I read from your papers really shows a development that's complex, that's multifaceted, that's multi-layered, and that's dynamic. And for that reason, I think that it sheds light on some of the intricacies of government and NGO relations. So taken together, the papers show how NGO growth happened not in a smooth, linear fashion, but with ebbs and flows, advances and retreats, and with complex interactions and mutually constitutive actors across space and time. Jessica and Martha, for example, noted that local governments must learn how to regulate the provision of essential services. There's a learning process that's happening. It's a social process. It's, like you were saying, a give and take learning through experience. Jennifer also talked about different levels of government and how at those different levels of government will have different ways of interacting with NGOs. And I think that's really important to capture that kind of that dynamic. The innovative feature of China literature is precisely its ability to deepen our understanding of that dynamic process, and also to show us that there's a variety of NGOs and a variety of relationships with the state. And I think in the North American nonprofit sector studies, that kind of variation is largely accounted for by regime characteristics that shape the channels of access. But you have an analysis that I think would benefit to the American and North American literature because it incorporates other variables other than the institutional context. Now, the second theme that I saw was important was the emphasis on agency. Despite the constraints on political space, the research that you've presented also tells us the story of the many ways that organizations have adapted and succeeded in carving out a space for their own independent activities. It's interesting to see some organizations moving towards more advocacy, others retreating away from advocacy. We haven't talked a lot about advocacy, but it's one of my favorite areas. We see organizations moving towards business models and adopting more entrepreneurial approach. Again, all of that is strategic given the institutional context. If there's one lesson from Canadian studies that I would share with you, it's the importance of agency. When you look at Canada and when you look at Quebec, two similar institutional contexts, but very different patterns of agency. At the federal level, the nonprofit sector, when they got together, they emphasized, in the face of the fiscal restraint in the 90s, a lot of federal funding cutbacks, they emphasized the need to develop other sources of funding in order to be more independent and autonomous to the state. And what happened is that they started lobbying around regulation, charitable giving, law, legislative frameworks, and they professionalized in their interaction with government. In Quebec, it's quite interesting because, as I said, there's not a lot of charitable giving. So when the government tried to cut back, they answered in response that they were an important and valuable player in the policy realm, that advocacy was important. They pushed government in order to have triennial funding. They also have been able to secure funding specifically for advocacy. And for them, their independence is not in the funding relationship, but in the assertion, a recognition of their important role in that challenge function. So two different strategies, two different outcomes, yet within the same kind of country. So I think that organizations, they make choices, they position themselves, the way that they represent themselves to the state as their value to the policy process is important. And I know that in China, this hasn't been negotiated yet. There's a lot of definitions that are out there. There's no real sectoral identity that develops. But once these organizations start coming together, I invite you to pay attention to the way that they position themselves, the social representations that they put into the political arena, the way that they position themselves. I think that says a lot about the role and vision that we have for the sector. And again, in Canada, it's quite different. I also wanted to say a comment about identity because I think identity is important, but related to social enterprise. In Quebec, there's a huge movement of social economy. There's a huge literature around social enterprise in Canada. Yet the social economy organizations are quite different in Quebec than they are in the rest of Canada. In the rest of Canada, social enterprise is essentially a business model, a governance model. And so it's a way to obtain reach your social mission in the way that you can generate funds. But in Quebec, it's an identity. It's way more than that. The model is secondary. The number one thing is that social economy organizations are there to meet needs in the community. And so when you think about your spectrum, Tim, I think that has a huge impact, how you identify yourself on your capacity to resist the push towards the business model. And in Quebec, they've been quite good at resisting that. So China, I think, is inspiring new insights and understanding regarding the central role of power as well in state-society relations. That's something that's completely overlooked, I think, in the American literature. These studies illustrate that it's possible to pay attention to social relations, to agency and power without really ignoring the institutional context. And both those variables, I think, are important. Another interesting view that Canadian scholars can offer to China is our emphasis on multi-level governance. Canada is a unique system in that we have the federal government, we have provincial government, both trying to serve social purposes, economic purposes, sometimes in a collaborative way, sometimes in a more confrontational way. But we also have municipal governments. And so there's lots of research using scalar analysis like you had presented, Jennifer, looking at this multidimensional relationship and the interaction between government and the voluntary sector. So I think there's a lot that Canadian scholarship can offer for that kind of spatial analysis. I also think that the Canadian context is interesting for all of those that are looking at local governments and the greater importance of local governments. In Canada, we've gone through place-based policymaking where we've moved away from national frameworks towards giving more local governments the power to implement social policies in the way that's more reflective of different communities, and again, bringing in the nonprofit sector. So there's some interesting theory that Canadian scholarship can bring to the study of NGOs in China. And what I was struck by when I was looking at your papers was that there was a lot of similarities between the trends that you were identifying in China and the trends that we have all over the world, right? Contracting out, we've heard a lot about that, co-optation, this tension between advocacy and service delivery, the importance of regulatory framework and how that constrains and shapes behavior and organizational structure. And yet, I didn't hear a lot in your papers of the nonprofit sector field as, and I was surprised by that because there's a lot that has been written on these subjects, which I think you could benefit from using. And I know that it's a challenge when you're in a field area of taking something that's more Western or North American and trying to adapt it. But I do think that for me, when I was reading your material, I see China as an interesting laboratory for some of those hypotheses. And it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel all the time. You can kind of take a framework, ask a question, test it, and then improve. And I think that there would be huge, huge benefit, not probably for those studying Chinese politics, but for those outside, of seeing what's happening in this kind of new context, which is I mean, the transformation in China is so intense and rapid. There's a lot that we can learn outside. And I'm convinced that China can provide a large, heterogeneous, fast-evolving laboratory for testing and illustrating many of the things that we've been talking about in other contexts. In particular, I think it would be interesting to see how the sector responds to withdrawal of international support. In the federal government in Canada, there's a huge withdrawal of federal government funding, and so we are also going to be observing how groups are going to be responding, whether they're going to be moving to new models. We're talking about social impact bonds in Canada, social finance. So, you know, many governments, many countries are going through this kind of retreat of funding. I think it's also important to track how NGOs navigate the transition to become service delivery providers and the contracting out. In Canada, we've gone through contracting out since the early 90s. We're now moving towards large multi-purpose contracting, and that has huge implications for the nonprofit sector, huge implications for organizations working with marginalized groups, huge implications for political representation. And I think you can learn from those trends in Canada, but we can also learn from the way other countries are navigating them. So as you move forward in your efforts, I invite you to think about and make explicit in your work the transferability of your analysis and lessons to draw from the Chinese experience to the broader nonprofit field. I've gained a lot from just reading your material, and I think you could make a more explicit effort in interacting with that nonprofit field. I have the sense that there are many subfields. There's development, there's authoritarian regimes, there's sociology, but no nonprofit field. But they would benefit from hearing your voice because it tends to be dominated by that Western model. One question that I had for you, which I was surprised because is that I didn't hear a lot of people talking about the private sector. And yet, in the nonprofit field, as a research area, we talk about the public, the private, and the nonprofit sector, and it's this tripartite relationship. And I was surprised because it was this period from 90s to today, isn't it a period of huge economic growth? And so I wonder, what role does the private sector play in that? So that was my question to you. Thanks.